In this video, we're going to learn how to use gauges on the show page to display values. This is the 5th video in a set of 10 about sensors. For this video, you're going to need the JackBord Basic, a USB-C cable, a PC or a Chromebook, and either the Google Chrome web browser or the Microsoft Edge web browser. Gauges display information in an easy-to-read form. And originally gauges were all mechanical because electronics and computers hadn't been invented. So basically what a gauge looks like is they're usually round and you have a scale around the outside and then a pointer that indicates or points to a given value. And so they used a mechanism to move a pointer around a dial or face, much like the hands of a watch. And gauges and dials have been around for hundreds of years, well at least 100 years. Were the first invented by John Logan in 1883. And this diagram over here shows the diagram from his original patent application in 1883. So a dial is basically a means of displaying information to people. So next let's look at the parts of a gauge or a dial. So you have a round face, and here we have the scale that goes around the outside. And on the left-hand side, you generally have the minimum, which in this case is 0. And then on the right-hand side, you have the maximum, so that's 120. And that shows you the range of values that this dial or gauge is capable of displaying. Then the next thing you have is the pointer, which is this arrow or stick here. And this indicates the current value being displayed by the gauge. And essentially, all gauges have this similar format. And then finally, you've got often a name, but sometimes, like in this case, just a units of display. So this dial is displaying temperatures from 0 to 120 degrees Celsius. Now, as you can see here, gauges actually come in many different shapes and sizes. So this first one is a purely mechanical gauge. It measures pressure, and it has no electronic parts in it whatsoever. It uses a round face. Then this next one is an old multimeter, and this is the gauge here. And there's the indicator, and you can see the scale. And this is electrical, so it's got virtually no electronics and definitely no computers. And then this guy over here is a purely electronic gauge, so there are no mechanical moving parts, whereas these two over here both have mechanically moving parts. And this uses a scale shown in colors, so the green is obviously good, orange not so good, and red is bad, and it basically measures the air-fuel ratio for cars. So this is an electronic gauge with no moving parts. And then finally we come to the type of gauge that we're going to look at today, which is a purely software gauge. Now these gauges here show the engine status for a Boeing 747 aircraft. And as you can see, there are no mechanical parts at all, they're entirely software. But they still have a face, they have a current value indicator, and inside it shows you a numeric representation of the value as well, just like for the electronic gauge. With the JackBord Basic and the dashboard, we can display a gauge of our own on the show page using the PG command. And the PG command is shown here. And it looks like a lot, but it's actually really simple. So the first thing we have is an X value, which is where we want the gauge to appear on the screen left and right. Next we have the Y value, which is how high or how far up and down the screen we want it to be. And then the value is the reading that we're going to display. So over here we've got 250, and that's where the needle is pointing. The width is how wide the gauge will be. The name is the name displayed underneath, so we've got light here. And then finally the minimum and maximum values are the minimum here, which is 0, and the maximum here, which is 1000. And these are form the range of the gauge. So the example shown down on the right-hand side there is putting it at 10 along the x-axis, 150 pixels downwards on the y-axis. The value is 250, and you can see that indicated here. It's 400 pixels wide. The name, which is n equals, is light, and you can see that shown at the bottom of the gauge here. And then finally we've got the minimum value, which is shown there, and then the maximum value, which is 1000, and that's shown over here. So this display is essentially giving us a range from 0 to 1000. It's called light, and it's displaying currently a value of 250. Okay, we're here on the dashboard and we're on the Start tab. So the first thing we're going to do is click on the Show tab here on the right, and that will bring up the Show page. And this is where you can display graphics, gauges, etc. So all sorts of things. So the next thing we'll do is we'll go back to the command line down here and we'll start putting in the command. So we're going to go PG, which is put gauge. We want the X value to be 10, and we want it to be displayed at Y 150. Then we're going to make the gauge's value 250. And next we're going to put in the width of the gauge, which is W, and that's going to be equal to 400. And then we're going to add a name, so N is equal to the name, and we'll make that light. And then we're going to put in the minimum value, which is going to be 0. And finally the maximum value of the gauge, which is going to be 1000. So this is our gauge command. We press enter and it displays our gauge. So we have a minimum value of 0, the name is light, it has a maximum value of 1000, and we're currently sitting at 250. So if we wanted to change the value of the gauge, so I'm just going to use the up arrow to bring the command back, and I can change 250 to say 500. And you can see the gauge changes to 500. And then finally, if I wanted to make it 1000, I just use the up arrow to bring the command back, and I go 1000. So this is a gauge, and it's a purely software gauge. There are no moving parts, it's not electronic, it's purely in software. Next, we're going to have a quick look at using gauges with variables. So the variable we're going to look at is the S_UPS or system uptime variable. And this basically holds the number of seconds that the JackBord has been running. So if we enter this command at the command prompt, we'll get this result. So in this case, it's telling us the JackBord has been running for 187 seconds. Right, I'm here on the command line, so we'll type the command in. So we're going to go jp uptime, and then use the system variable _UPS secs and press it. And so basically it's telling us that the virtual JackBord has been running for 2,544 seconds. If I run it again, 5.3, 5.5, 5.6, 5.6, and 5.7 or 5.8. So we're displaying the values of the S_ups system variable, which is the number of seconds that the virtual JackBord has been running. So now what we're going to do is use a gauge to display the uptime of the JackBord. And so you'll notice in the command, we've replaced, whereas before we had values of like 200, 250, we've replaced the value with the S_UPS system variable. And then the result is this down here. So we're displaying uptime, and that's the value. Okay, we're back on the command page. So let's, and we've got the show page up over here. So we're going to put gauge, put it at 10, 150. And for the input, we're going to use that system variable. So we go S_UPS. Then we're going to make the gauge 400 wide. We're going to make the name of the gauge will be uptime. And the minimum value will be equal to 0. And the maximum will make it 4,000 because we've been up quite a while. So essentially, put it at 10, 150, use the uptime variable as the input, and the rest is pretty much standard. Press enter, and there we go. There's our gauge. And then if I run it again, you can see that it updates. So this is basically using a gauge to display the value of a variable. And in this particular case, it happens to be the system uptime variable. Okay, to summarize, gauges started out as purely mechanical means of displaying readings, and that was basically because they were invented over 100 years ago and computers and electronics didn't exist. And so all gauges have a minimum value and a maximum value and a pointer, which is this here, and the pointer shows the current value. And on the JackBord with the show page, we can actually create our own gauges. And furthermore, you can use variables to be the input values for those gauges. In the next video, we're going to use a gauge to make a simple light meter that displays light readings. To get directly to the next video, simply visit jb.works and search the TMT code shown on your screen. For more information and to get help, visit jb.works.